Okay, the country's premiers have been meeting with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau throughout the last several hours. The meeting has ended now. The goal was to devise a joint response to Donald Trump's potential tariffs and possibly a retaliation, because as early as Monday, the president-elect could slap a 25% tariff on all Canadian goods. New Brunswick Premier Susan Holt was in those meetings, and she joins us now from Old City Hall here in Ottawa. Premier Holt, it's good to speak with you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, David.
It was a very united front with an notable exception today. What does Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta's refusal to sign on to this common plan, say about where things stand for Team Canada in dealing with Donald Trump?
Well, I think they show that Team Canada is unified in a shared goal. We are going to fight these tariffs, and we all agree that the outcome that we're looking for is to eliminate them, ideally prevent them from happening, and eliminate them as quickly as possible. None of us are excited about the prospect of tariffs on our own economy, and so we all agree on that as well. I think there was real strong collaboration and discussion, and I think everyone agreed on the next steps. And so I think that that's a great place to work from.
I'm being told that you looked at not a dollar-for-dollar retaliation against the full value of what Donald Trump has threatened, because that would be enormous and even more crippling than what the 25% might do. But it's somewhere around 150 billion Canadian dollars in tariffs that were discussed by the premiers today. Bloomberg now reporting 105 billion, which I assume is the U.S. value. Is that kind of where you've landed?
We put a lot of different options on the table and identified what our best first step would be should the tariffs come into place. And it's going to depend on what those tariffs look like, because we still don't know whether it's going to be a broad-based 25% tariff across the economy or whether it will be applied specifically to certain goods. And so we have a number of different options available to us in response, depending on the severity of the action from the Trump administration. And so we discussed all sorts of options of all sorts of different values, but we need to see what the president is actually going to do first, and then we're ready to respond accordingly.
Are you worried at all, though, Premier, by what Danielle Smith has said? Because, you know, even Francois Legault said that you've agreed not to exclude anything, right? That you want to have as united a front with as many options as possible on the table. Doug Ford said you need to think about region, but country comes first because he's coming for all of us. And it's quite frankly his auto sector, as the Prime Minister pointed out, that was directly targeted by President Trump. But if the Premier of Alberta is saying don't touch our energy, that creates domestic challenges as well as these cross-border challenges. Are you worried about what this does to unity and your ability to respond to this?
Well, I can understand the feeling, right? Each of us as premiers, and as Doug Ford and Francois Legault demonstrated, we have unique economies, and there's different things that will hurt us in different ways. And all of our instincts are to protect our provinces. I certainly am here to fight for New Brunswickers and for what's in their best interest. What's in their best interest is a strong Canada and is eliminating the tariffs. So we have to make sure that we have the tools available to us, even if just the threat of the use of those tools could be effective in the fight against these tariffs. And so we know what we want to do first. We know what we don't want to do unless we have to do it. But there is, right now, we can't predict what's going to happen with the president, and we need to be prepared to react in the way that is going to limit the damage on the Canadian economy and eliminate the tariffs as quickly as possible. That's our shared goal, and I believe Premier Smith shares those same objectives.
But do you think her objection to using Alberta oil removes the threat of that from the toolbox for Team Canada? That this is not something that can credibly be argued because of this dissent from her today?
Well, I think Team Canada is going to be meeting on a very regular basis, including next week. As soon as we know whether the tariffs have been put in place and what they look like, we're going to be back together to devise the exact approach that we're going to take then. And then when it's time to take another step, then we're all going to be back together talking about what we can agree to do at that time. And so I think it's possibly premature. I think we are all unified in the conversation today. We're all unified in the next steps. We're unified in the objective. And we all recognize the need to support each other's provinces, and that the best way to do that is to work as one Team Canada.
Well, certainly we heard from the Prime Minister today that no sector or region should carry an unfair burden, and that's sort of a core principle that you all agreed to there. How reassured are you on that there's the financial weight or the financial resources there, to compensate affected sectors, affected provinces, and affected workers should it come to that?
Well, that is something that we talked about today, and there's more conversation to be had on the kind of supports that we can put in place through the federal government and in partnership with the provinces to support New Brunswickers and Canadians who might see their jobs impacted or their companies impacted. And so we have to look at the impact that that could have on our economy, that kind of loss of jobs and work, and how we best support it as we would do during any other time. I think the kind of package that was put together and proposed by the federal government is strong, is strategic, it's focused on how we can inject the most pain to the targeted Americans that reduces the risk and the impact to the Canadian economy. I think that's the right strategy. I think the federal government has done good work on that, and we look forward to working with them on the supports that we can put should the tariffs have their projected impact on New Brunswickers and on Canadians.
Okay, one last question, Premier. After a lot of skepticism about the border plan, Doug Ford was briefed on it yesterday by Minister LeBlanc, and he called it phenomenal, which was not a phrase we've heard many premiers uttering about the federal response. What is your assessment of the border plan as sort of articulated today by Minister McGuinty, Minister Miller, and what you heard in private from the Prime Minister?
Well, I share Premier Ford's views. It's a strong plan. It's focused on the kinds of things that are going to benefit Canadians and help improve our security. Honestly, my concerns with the border, particularly that New Brunswick shares with Maine, is more of what's coming into our country from the U.S. than what's going the other way. But they've put together a thoughtful program that's going to help us get at that as well and put resources where we need them to keep New Brunswickers and Canadians safe.
New Brunswick Premier Susan Holt, always appreciate the time. Thanks for being here on a busy day.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Okay, so as we discussed, the Prime Minister and the Premiers were hoping to come out of their meeting with a united response to Donald Trump's tariff threat, but one Premier, Danielle Smith, says she is not on board with the federal government's plan. In a statement, the Alberta leader says the Premiers agreed on several strategies. However, she writes, federal government officials continue to publicly and privately float the idea of cutting off energy supply to the United States and imposing export tariffs on Alberta energy and other products to the United States. Until these threats cease, Alberta will not be able to fully support the federal government's plan in dealing with the threatened tariffs. Smith posted this statement while the Prime Minister and the Premiers were giving their closing press conference. Here's some of that reaction.
Protect your jurisdiction, but country comes first. Canada's a priority. And I don't believe in jeopardizing one sector or another. Premier Smith's oil is Ontario's auto sector. When Donald Trump comes at us, he's not going to say, well, let's not worry about Ontario, they're good people, or Alberta. He's coming full tilt at Canadians as a whole.
The interest of this country means we're going to have to look at everything we can, and we'll make sure that it's fair across the country, but nothing can be off the table if the U.S. continues to choose to move forward with these punishing tariffs.
Okay, it's time to bring in the power panel to talk about what has been a busy day here in Ottawa. Amanda Alvaro is a former Liberal Party communications strategist. Jordan Leichnitz is a former NDP strategist. And here with me in the studio, Tim Powers is a former strategist for Conservative parties, and Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor of the Hill Times. Good to see you, gang, on a busy day. Amanda, start with you. I wonder, of the 13, 12 premiers are fully on board. What does Danielle Smith's dissent do to the Team Canada approach here? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, there's nothing like weakening your negotiating position by negotiating against yourself when it's T minus 5 days to inauguration. So, I think it's problematic. And I think the premiers, Premier Holt sort of skirted that answer a bit. I think Premier Ford was much more direct about it. And again, this is kind of the best of Premier Ford that we see, and that is country is first, and that we need every negotiating chip on the table, that nothing can be off the table at this time. And I think both the Premier Ford, as well as the Prime Minister reiterated that. And I think the message was really clear. If we want to promote a robust, healthy, mutually beneficial trading partnership, then we have have to make sure that when we get to the table, that we have all of the retaliatory measures and tools at our disposal to keep that alive and well. So I think her going rogue is very challenging, but she telegraphed this. She came back from Mar-a-Lago saying that she was looking for that carve out. So it's not really a surprise. It's just an unfortunate turn of events at this, First Minister's meeting that happened today.
Jordan, what do you think this does to Canada's ability to have these threats against the U.S. administration, or the incoming U.S. administration, because this is going to inflame a potential domestic audience for sure, with the Premier saying this?
Yeah, I think it's hugely harmful. And the reality is that energy, particularly oil and gas, are really Canada's biggest lever when it comes to confronting the American tariffs. So if you take that off the table, our negotiating position is significantly weakened. I think what's really troubling here is that you're seeing Premier Smith opening up fronts almost on a national unity basis here. She's asking for Alberta to be exempted from tariffs that would be really applied across the country. These aren't things that would be singling Alberta out. And I think what she's doing here is really harming the overall chances that Canada is going to be able to successfully confront the tariff threat. There's just no scenario in which Alberta wins or is successful in getting some sort of exemption, and the rest of Canada loses, and that's going to be good for Albertans. That's not real. So I think she's making actually a pretty reckless move here, and it's one that really puts the whole country at risk.
Tim, we both come from an oil-producing place. It's a big part of the economy. Andrew Furey, we spoke to him earlier, said, I don't want to do it, but it's got to be there as an option because the threat is so dire. Danielle Smith's outlining on that.
Well, I guess after spending the weekend with Kevin O'Leary, the whisperer of Trump for Canada, we're so lucky he's in that role, and the president-elect, she's believing that it's better to appear chaotic than not. Look, there's some logic, I think, to her position. It's not like the Premier of Alberta, whether it be Danielle Smith or Ralph Klein or anybody, is easily likely going to say yes, put a tariff on oil and gas. I think for her own domestic purposes, she probably at first blush has to do this, and if the federal government does it, she can say, well, I stood firm or tried to stand firm on all of that. I think what to watch will be something Jordan alluded to. How forceful will she become if we get to that particular place? Right now, it's probably fine to be like this. It's going to be fascinating tomorrow, though, with Governor Carney announcing in Edmonton to see how he responds to this particular question, because part of Mr. Carney's offering is going to be, hey, I can give some voice to the West, and I'm from the West, but I suspect he will answer, as others have answered, that will stand for Canada.
But, is it fine to have this position now when the call from her and other premiers is it's time to show national leadership, it's time to pull together, it's time to speak with one voice, and everyone has said they're willing to do it?
I don't think it's fine for Canada, but right? I think she thinks it's fine for her.
Or domestic political
Alberta.
audience in Alberta.
Yes.
Right, okay. Cheryl, what are your thoughts on this? Because Doug Ford gave a pretty strong rebuke. And as the Prime Minister pointed out, the only industry that's been specifically threatened by Donald Trump is the auto industry in Ontario. And Doug Ford said, we got to put country ahead of province.
Yeah. Listening to this whole thing during the press conference today kind of gave me that, and then seeing Premier Smith's tweet come through while the press conference was going on, made me think back to the G7 summit in Charlevoix, where President Trump left early, didn't sign the communique, and then
did sign it, but then blew it up.
And then from his plane started, chirping everybody that was left back in the room, and it gave me that same sense. It's almost like she's playing a little bit with that same playbook. She's gone down to kind of bend the knee a little, and speak to President Trump directly, or President-elect Trump directly. You can't help but wonder if she's already, in those face-to-face meetings, given him the assurance that this is off the table, and so she now has to stand firm in doing that by, removing herself and Alberta and the oil and gas and everything that goes along with that from this conversation, because she wants to remain in that position. It's not surprising, as was said before, that she'd take this position, but given the fact that everybody else is so united on it, it is really interesting that she would cast herself so specifically as as the lone wolf in this negotiation.
But it's interesting, Amanda, because I spoke with Scott Moe earlier this week, and no fan of the Prime Minister, let's be honest, right? And he has said, look, we have to say all options are there because it erodes our bargaining position to say otherwise, but that he has been reasonably assured by federal officials that anything to do with oil exports or export tariffs, that's really far down the list of options. Things have to be pretty bad for them to go to that, but you can't say we're never going to consider it. So it's notable to me that Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador, the other two sort of energy economies, that they're on board and saying this is an option, but it's not the first option.
Yeah, I mean, it's notable, but it's also the right thing to do. Imagine sabotaging the negotiation efforts ahead of the negotiation. You have to have all of the tools in the toolbox, right?
Yes, absolutely. You have to have all the tools. And Sherelle, just on your point, does this take a big tool out of it if Alberta says, don't use our prime industry, which is such a significant part of the Canadian economy?
Of course it does, because you can clearly say oil is something that the President-elect has talked about as, when he refers to Canada subsidizing, the U.S. subsidizing Canada. So this is something that he is interested in, so it makes sense to, keep it at the forefront of his mind. But at the same time, you can't just remove something so specifically that everybody else says, hey, we need this as, in our arsenal.
Tim, the next time we're going to hear from the Premier of Alberta, she's going to be in Washington for the inauguration. She's not doing media interviews to explain this. She just issued the statement, and because she's on vacation. It's interesting she can interrupt it to go see Donald Trump, but not to come here in person for this and speak to the choice she has made here today.
Well, don't forget, again, I do not think what she did was in the interest of Canada, but was certainly in the interest of her political challenges and opportunities in Alberta. She certainly has in Alberta, too, people who will have a more favorable view of the president-elect and some of the positions that he's taking, as chaotic and unnerving as they may be. So she's letting her domestic political agenda drive it. And don't forget why she's doing that. The man she succeeded, Jason Kenney, took a lot of grief for not fighting hard enough for the oil industry and the like. And the Alberta Conservative Party does a better job than the current Liberal Party at eating their own. So she's putting her survivalist tendencies first.